Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
And it is not Brexit Day, for which I have some sympathy for people persuaded into thinking that that was A, either desirable or B, ever remotely plausible. I appreciate the urge to shoot the messenger, but try not to. Reserve your anger and your disapproval for the people who told you it would be easy. The people who told you it would be a good idea. The people who told you that they needed us more than we needed them. The people who told you that it would be like trying to get the eggs out of a baked cake. I appreciate you're probably not ready yet to send them bouquets of flowers and bottles of champagne, but at least you were in possession of the facts you needed not to have been taken by surprise by recent events. Oh, what a tangled web we weave when first we practice to deceive. And guess what? They're still deceiving. Morning. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, and listen, I have in front of me a switchboard, a telephone switchboard with a variety of lines on it, a total of about 10. You are welcome to Banksy one now, if you wish. I'm just going to try and talk through the madness that we've inflicted upon ourselves and our country for reasons that remain rooted entirely in, at best, feeling and at worst, fantasy. It is possible that Theresa May will get her deal through Parliament today. It is possible that Jacob Rees-Mogg will stick... I haven't checked today. Has he changed his mind again yet? Do we know? Is Jacob Rees-Mogg still voting for slavery? Or is he going to vote against slavery? Either way, if you need an illustration of the absurd hypocrisies that are now inflated on the national stage in a way that no functioning democracy can continue to countenance, just have a look at the Mewling pencil. Boris Johnson will today quite possibly vote for something he has described as being demonstrably inferior to membership of the European Union, and he remains among the bookies' favourites for leader of the Conservative Party. Ditto my new best friend Dominic Raab, who is coming in at about 8, despite having said yesterday that he thinks we should go back to Brussels and insist that they reopen the withdrawal agreement. It's probably apocryphal, but it's still rather pithy. Albert Einstein's definition of insanity being doing the same thing over and over and over again in the hope of getting a different result. Philip Collins in the Times today makes a brilliant case for why Monsieur Raab should be the next leader of the Conservative Party, and I am inclined to agree with him, for reasons you'll need to read Philip's piece to fully appreciate. I have in front of me something that I probably should have read to you a million times before that referendum in June, but I didn't. And when I tell you the organs from which these headlines have been lifted, you'll realise that they can't back down. Even now, they refuse to accept responsibility for misleading, misunderstanding, and misrepresenting. If the members of my profession, and I'll run through these headlines in a moment, if the members of my profession responsible for the misrepresentations that I'm about to share with you worked in your profession, they would have been disbarred, they would have been defrocked, they would have been banned. But we don't really have any regulation in the media, so I could tell you a fib now, and nothing would happen to me. Nothing at all. I could have a guest sitting over there saying that he knows exactly how the German car industry is going to behave in the aftermath of a vote to leave the referendum, and if events conspire to prove that he was talking out of his well-upholstered backside, then I'll get him in again next week, get him to blow smoke up a different fundament in complete, blithe, entitled ignorance. For those of you not paying full attention, I refer, of course, to Lord Digby Jones in the context of that particular contribution to the public discourse. Daniel Hannan today is complaining that Article 50 shouldn't have been triggered so quickly and that no Brexiters had put pressure upon Theresa May to do so. Somewhat inconveniently, there are articles on the record written by him that that demonstrate his voice was among those celebrating the early triggering of Article 50. The rewriting of history is already underway. It's quite incredible. And they rely on you, of course. I appreciate that people listening to this programme are not exclusively in the Leave camp, or indeed never were, but I feel my mission in journalism is to protect people from bad actors. The problem is, of course, that very often the people you're trying to protect turn on you. But that is the cross I bear for Brexit. Here are some headlines from the British media over the last 20 years. You can, in many ways, take your pick. There's an excellent blog written by a chap under the pen name Tom Pride who has collated them. Oddly, you can also go to the European Union's own website and find a list of myths that they've collated but which we didn't do. I mean, honestly, hand on heart, I do wonder whether a newspaper with a really cheeky, chappy demeanour prior to 2016 would have actually thrived, because the British public do not like being lied to, and yet the British media never really provided what you might describe as a charismatic demolition of the deceits and the deceptions. You might have been able to find a measured or an objective account in The Guardian or even The Times, but it's not going to have the same punch as a headline that says, for example, this from the Daily Express, EC regulations to ban playgrounds. Just do me a quick favour, will you? Stick your head out the window, see if the playgrounds are still there. Oh, that's a relief. The Daily Telegraph, my father's old newspaper, rolling acres outlawed by Brussels. Brussels there poised apparently to ban fields. That got published. It got printed. I don't know, and I haven't checked whether any of these stories have been retracted. Sunday Express reported EU to scrap British exams. Not according to every school child I currently know. Mail on Sunday told us about the obscure EU law halting the sale of English oak seeds. But we must respect the vote that was built upon these bricks of bonkers Brexit bananas. Speaking of bananas, they'll be along in a minute. EU may try to ban sweet and toy ads, reported and this is where it gets serious, The Times. And you can tell it's a slightly more responsible approach to the issue because they put the word may in the headline. May try to ban sweet and toy ads, but the work is done. Daily Mail, EU to tell British farmers what they can grow. Daily Star, back in the days when it resembled a newspaper. EU bans boozing. Daily Mail, light ale to be forced to change its name by Eurocrats. The Sun, EU fanatics to be forced to sing dire anthem about EU motherland. The Times, British apple trees facing chop by EU. The Sunday People, EC plan to ban noisy toys. The Sun, EU to ban bagpipes and trapeze artists. The Daily Telegraph, children to be banned from blowing up balloons under EU safety rules. The Sun, straight cucumbers. The Sun, the Daily Mail, the Daily Express, curved bananas banned by Brussels bureaucrats. The Sun and the Daily Telegraph, Brussels bans barmaids from showing cleavage. And you'll probably be slightly worried to hear, I could carry on until about 1 o'clock. And that is why this line about having to respect the vote from 2016 is now an act of utter corruption. The people who wrote these stories, the people who referred to them on television and radio, the people who left them unchallenged, festering and fermenting in the collective consciousness of the British electorate, are now claiming that the results of these deceptions, these deceits, these embellishments and exaggerations must be respected, which means you need to wonder why. And I'm here to tell you. Why would anybody say this vote must be respected? Well, if you had spent a significant part of your career writing or discussing about motorists to be charged to drive in city centres under EU plans, the EU to stop binge drinking by slapping an extra tax on our booze, The Sun, the British loaf of bread being under threat from the EU, the Daily Mail, the truckers facing an EU ban on fry-ups in The Sun, the Daily Express reporting that the EU is to ban the Union flag from British meat packs. And on the one hand, who cares? But on the other hand, no, they didn't. No, they weren't. My personal favourite, or no, there's too much to choose from, but I do quite like this one. EU bans eating competition cakes. Now EU officials, this is the Express, want to control your candles. And I'm not even near the bottom of the first page of 3. So it's my profession that is responsible. It's not the Popping-J politicians. It's not the self-promoters and the sociopaths. In politics, the media is to blame. And I'm afraid the BBC is part of the problem, not because it... Well, actually, these things would have come up in paper reviews, wouldn't they? And they'd have been chuckled over and discussed, and then someone would have said, well, on the other hand, of course. But, in fact, what we have seen in this country for 30 years is a complete corruption of the free media. Because the only way an outsider can make sense of what happened in June 2016 is by looking through this catalogue of calumnies, this cavalcade of cons. I'm rather partial to an alliteration, as you may have noticed in the past. And that's the only way you can get your head around it. So we've sat here for years saying, but why? But what? I mean, last time we spoke to Jacob Rees-Mogg, we said, but what is it you can see that no one else can see? Because under any objective, evidence-based analysis, the collision of the red lines with the Good Friday Agreement renders everything you are saying either impossible or ridiculous or both. Something he has been forced to reluctantly concede at the very, very final hour, leaving himself in the stunning position of publicly saying, yes, I am voting for slavery. If you didn't see Emily Maitlis on Newsnight last night, then head online and give yourself a little treat. And that's it, isn't it? It's not his fault. I don't know whether he would have arrived at such a humiliating turn if the media hadn't created a playing field of such absurdity that people like him looked briefly plausible in the context of Brexit. But that's it, isn't it? It's just the journalists. It's all our fault. And indulge me for a moment longer. 21-gun salutes are just too loud, Brussels tells the Royal Artillery, Mail on Sunday. Brussels threatens charity shops and car boot sales, Daily Mail. Plot to axe British number plates for standardised EU design, Daily Express. Women to be asked intimate details about sex lives in planned EU census, Daily Express. British cheese faces extinction under EU rules, PA News. EU meddlers ban kids on milk rounds, The Sun and The Telegraph. British chocolate to be renamed Vegelate under EU rules, Daily Mail. EU to ban church bells, Daily Telegraph. British film producers warn of new EU threat to industry, The Independent. Kilts to be branded women's wear by EU, The Daily Record. Every single organ of note in this country has been peddling nonsense for decades. Some of it funny. I mean, I do stress. Of course I do. If you're wondering whether I'm going to take any calls today, the answer is possibly not. I do stress that many of these decisions editorially will not have been taken for sinister reasons. They will have just been funny. I worked at the Daily Express, not during a period of rabid right-wingery, admittedly, but during a period of tabloid sensibility. I'm a fan of puns. Some of the finest puns in the history of the English language have appeared in Sun headlines. So it's not as if everybody sat around the editorial table and said, how can we continue to corrupt the British people's understanding of our EU membership? They just thought it was funny, and it gets a reaction. Eurocrats to ban crayons and colouring pencils. The Sun, which of course would have left some of their columnists with an enormous problem. If they were to ban crayons, one wonders how on earth Richard Littlejohn would be able to get his thoughts committed to paper. EU wants to ban your photos of the London Eye, the Daily Express. Corgis to be banned by the EU, the Daily Mail. EU forcing cows to wear nappies, the Daily Mail. Now, you, as a person who voted the other way to me in 2016, of course you didn't believe all of these stories, or possibly even now in 2020 hindsight, you didn't believe any of them, any more than all the people queue up to tell me that they knew the bus promising £350 million for the NHS was just a suggestion, and no one took it seriously, despite the fact that the man that ran the Vote Leave campaign considers that to have been the masterstroke that delivered them the result that they saw. Nobody actually believed it. Nobody actually believed that firemen's poles were going to be outlawed by the EU, Daily Mail, or that the EU had ordered farmers to give toys to pigs, The Times, or that Brussels was to force the EU flag onto England shirts, the Daily Mail, or that the English Channel was to be renamed the Anglo-French Pond, also the Daily Mail. And I'm not even halfway through these stories. So when I sit here every single day and try to work out how people I love and like and respect have ended up so far down a rabbit hole of misinformation, misdirection, manipulation, and in some case outright lies, I think I've been wasting my time. I think the answer has been right in front of me, right beside me, all along. So I thought that journalism, like a naive little child, was about speaking truth to power and about giving the public the facts and the evidence that they needed to arrive at an informed conclusion. I never really realised in all these years that for an awful lot of people who do what I do for a living or do what I used to do for a living, for an awful lot of them, it's all about kicks and giggles. Oh, that's fun. You know, when Johnson talked about discovering with delight the noise, the sound of a shattering greenhouse when he was lobbing these bricks and rocks of nonsense from Brussels, stumbled on it entirely by accident after arriving in Brussels as the Daily Telegraph's correspondent shortly after being dismissed from the Times for making up a quote from his own godfather. Boris Johnson discovered that there was fame and fortune to be had in telling lies about the European Union. And look where he is now, still sniffing the steps of 10 Downing Street. And that's it, isn't it? We could sit here for years. It's just journalism. And this, remember, is, quotes, respectable journalism. The advent of the internet meant that people already persuaded that the European Union was somehow their enemy could dive into an online dungeon and find yet more evidence of manacles and handcuffs, racks and torture machines. And of course, the beauty of the internet is that you can do so exclusively in the company of people who are as misled as you are, as misinformed as you are. There's nobody there to say, hang on a minute, lads, I'm pretty sure they're not making cows wear nappies. You get to create what I think has become known as an echo chamber, in which all of this becomes, if not true, then unchallenged. EU to ban selling eggs by the dozen, Daily Mail. New eggs cannot be called eggs, also Daily Mail. Brussels to ban HGV drivers from wearing glasses, The Times. EU outlaws teeth whitening products, the Daily Mail. Smoky bacon crisps face EU ban, Sunday Times. That's all, isn't it? That's it. It's nothing to do with the Jacob Rees-Moggs of this world. They have been the seagulls following the trawler of the British newspaper. And I don't think, as I've said already, I don't think the British newspapers did it out of malice or conspiracy. Maybe a slight steer came from some of the owners latterly, but going back 30 years, they weren't sitting there in their offshore palaces determining that their minions and journalists should write this stuff. They were just looking at the reaction. Well, the punters seem to like this stuff. EU bans mince pies, the Daily Mail. EU plot to rename Trafalgar Square and Waterloo Station, the Daily Express. EU to ban lollipop lady sticks, the News of the World. Forget the campaigns, forget the bus, forget the campaigners, forget that despicable Breaking Point poster unveiled just hours before Joe Cox was murdered by a man who'd reached his own personal white supremacist breaking point. Forget it all. Think about the field on which the campaign was conducted and reflect upon the impact that this almost unending cavalcade of calumnies created. That the pitch wasn't just slanted, it was at 45 degrees, with Remain at the bottom and Leave at the top of the slope with all the balls. It's a miracle. It's a miracle that Remain got 48%. An absolute miracle. And also a testament to the fact that many of us can see through cant like this, although that's a little bit self-serving, because I didn't realise how much of it there had been. I wonder whether that's the biggest lesson to take away for now. Don't just turn the page, James, because you know it's rubbish. You can't just turn the page because you know it's rubbish, not if somebody else is inflating it as real or plausible or true. Stop actually campaigning for Remain and focus entirely on unpicking the lies of the Leave. And that is why, if you're wondering quite why I've gone off on this rather lengthy contemplation of my own profession, that is why they are now telling you that you have to respect the vote. Because the alternative would be to admit that the vote was built on lies, misinformation, misunderstanding, weapons-grade ignorance, and profound deceit perpetrated by precisely the people now telling you that the vote must be respected. Because the alternative for them would be to put their hands up and admit that they have dedicated decades to deceiving you. And that's why today we're in a complete mess. But that's why today it's a mess that nobody who's listened to this program over the last 3 years has the right to be remotely surprised by. The minute you write it down, it falls apart. The one thing they can't admit is that nothing achievable is preferable to what we already had. The only person to admit that is Boris Johnson, sort of, by describing the thing that he's now going to vote for out of a sort of necessity as being worse than what we already have. Jacob Rees-Mogg finds himself today in the frankly hilarious position of voting for what he himself has described as slavery. But because he does so in a pantomime posh accent, a significant swathe of the British population don't see him for what he is. A charlatan. A shyster. A pantomime toff. But none of them, not Johnson, not Rees-Mogg, not Hannon, none of them could have thrived without this backdrop of utter and complete nonsense, without this undiluted draft of mildly xenophobic, anti-European Union rhetoric. Traditional Irish funeral under threat from EU, the Daily Telegraph and the Times. Commission to force fishermen to wear hairnets, the Daily Telegraph. Brussels to ban herbal cures, the Daily Express. Oh, wow, a late appearance for The Guardian. Bureaucrats declare Britain is not an island, The Guardian. EU bid to ban life sentences for murderers, the Daily Express. New EU map makes Kent part of France, the Sunday Telegraph. EU tells Welsh how to grow their leeks, the Times. We never had a prayer. We never had a prayer. And still, these people who perpetrated these fibs, these lies, these nonsenses, insist that the vote built on believing these stories needs to be respected. Take a moment out of your morning, would you, to tell me why? On 0345 6060 973. Alternatively, tell me why you don't blame the media. You blame somebody else, or you don't think anybody needs to be blamed because it's all going so brilliantly well. 0345 6060 973. Don't feel obliged, because if I were to roughly estimate how much I've got left in the tank after a 30-minute uninterrupted contemplation of the chaos inflicted upon my country by conmen, spivs and shysters, right now, I reckon I'm only about 10% in. Democrats say Santa must be a woman. The Sun. Now EU crackpots demand gypsy MPs. The Daily Express. Brussels to outlaw mushy peas. The Sun, the Daily Mail, the Telegraph, the Times. Brussels says shellfish must be given rest breaks on journeys. The Times. Pets must be pressure cooked after death. The Sunday Telegraph. EU puts speed limit on children's roundabouts. The Daily Express. 2-for-1 bargains to be scrapped by the EU. The Daily Mirror. EU madness. Chat up bar girl and pub will be fined. The Daily Star. Queen to be forced to get her own tea by EU. The Sun. Do you know, I'd quite like to click on that one. I have no idea what the first paragraph of the story would contain. EU tells women to hand in worn-out sex toys. Ditto The Sun. British rhubarb to be straight. EU to ban rocking horses. Both The Sun. Scotch whisky rebranded as dangerous chemical by EU. The Daily Telegraph. There's no mystery. There's no conspiracy. There's no project. It's just 20, 30 years of utter bilge served up to the British public by self-serving journalists, editors, columnists and proprietors. That's all. Everything makes sense once you understand that. The only thing that doesn't make sense is how anybody could think that the call to respect a vote built by journalists and politicians peddling nonsense like this is acting in good faith. All they are doing when they say that is saying, please don't dig too deep into why all these people voted to leave the European Union, because then they'll find the massive pile of lies, misunderstandings and misinformation that I was part of peddling. Oh, all right then. Nick's in Wimborne. Nick, you better speak, because otherwise I'm going to hit the 3-hour record and not take a single call. What's on your mind, my friend?
Thank you, James. Thank you for letting me on. Brilliant show, as always, but the list is extraordinary.
I haven't even finished.
I know. And the fact the list is extraordinary is the fact that I thought you were cherry-picking, but you're really not. I mean, it's just day in, day out, and you could go for it. I mean, before the referendum, I actually copied... I rescued them out of the dustbin because the guy upstairs voted Brexit. So I rescued all the Mail and Express papers and actually just basically scanned them because I thought they've just got to be kept.
Yes.
You know,
telling us it's all going to be brilliant. The steel of the new Iron Lady, and of course they haven't learned anything. The front of the Express today, darkest hour for democracy, utter bilge, and the front of the Mail, which has improved immeasurably since the last editor, but I'm afraid today takes at least a small step back when it says 11 p.m. tonight was meant to be the moment Britain became a proud sovereign nation once more. That word sovereign already completely unpicked, completely discredited as an argument, but there it is on the front of the Mail. Oh, happy days.
And James, isn't that the point? That this is where people get that feeling of what sovereignty is about? Because this is what I couldn't understand. Before you actually started saying this morning, I heard, I've asked people, what does sovereignty actually mean? You've done it on your show. I've heard it many times. And people really can't give you a tangible reason once you actually shoot down the obvious. But it's this drip by drip by drip of that 20 years of that stuff, which is funny. But that's what actually gets massed up into the word sovereignty. And, that's where take back control comes from, doesn't it? All this control, apparently, people have over our lives, those damn Europeans. And realistically, where's it come from? Our own country.
And in isolation, all of these stories are quite funny. British cheese faces extinction under EU rules. Oh, how we chuckled. EU to ban selling eggs by the dozen. Oh, how we giggled. EU orders farmers to give toys to pigs. Oh, how we howled and snorted. But, of course, when they're not in isolation, when it's a drip, drip, drip over 30 years, culminating in a ludicrous binary referendum called by a man trying to protect his own party from an attack of the killer racists, then it becomes very, very unfunny indeed.
Yeah. Can I just say one thing, James, about your show yesterday as well, just to tag on? Because I wanted to phone yesterday. I have to stop myself phoning, to be honest, because your programme is brilliant. But when you were talking yesterday about not writing anything down, it just occurred to me that if they'd written anything down the first time, when it was just all unicorns and fear, all right, it would have blown the Tory party and the Labour Party again, apart, because they would have been arguing in the campaign against themselves bitterly on stuff written down. And that is why I believe they don't want to have another referendum, because I have this thing in my mind that the next referendum campaign will be like the Tory party, two kind of like old galleons side by side firing cannonballs at each other. The only thing that's going to be a destruction of another referendum will be the Tory party and probably the Labour Party as well. But, it's not, this idea that it's undemocratic, it'll be a fiasco, but it'll be a fiasco for the Tory party.
Well, you talk of a sort of purging, don't you? I mean, the Tory party, of course, are historically the party of power, or one of the main parties of power, and while the idea of a circular firing squad has its attractions, I've got to remind you who's on the other side of the House of Commons at the moment, and the idea of handing the reins of power to him fills very few people with either optimism or pleasure. It does fill some people, although he's currently getting absolutely mullered by the don't-knows in polling on who we'd most like to see as Prime Minister. Nick, thank you. Here's Daniel Hannan shortly after Article 50 was triggered. Only now, perhaps, will all sides accept that Britain really is leaving the EU. The triggering of Article 50 sets in motion a legal process. By the end of March 2019, deal or no deal, we shall be out. Some commentators see this deadline as a disadvantage to Britain, but I'm blowed if I can understand why. Imagine the alternative. And here's Daniel Hannan today. The decision to trigger Article 50 without a plan was not the fault of the Leave campaign. The Leave campaign promised that the process wouldn't start without a plan in place. He says there wasn't pressure from Eurosceptics. So 2 years ago, some commentators see this deadline as a disadvantage to Britain, but I'm blowed if I can understand why. Today, decision to trigger Article 50 without a plan was not the fault of Leave campaign. Leave campaign promised process wouldn't start without a plan in place. I know Daniel Hannan takes his reputation and his honour very seriously, so I will share with you immediately his response to my tweet asking him to explain himself. Paul's in Milton Keynes. Paul, it was all very simple all along, wasn't it? It's a bit like the end of an episode of Scooby-Doo when we take the mask off this monster and it turns out just to have been the British newspapers all along?
Oh, good morning. Thanks for taking my call. I've got to put the blame for this to, like myself, the general public, because there were people out there who were telling the truth, people like yourself and others. There were people saying...
I'm going to excuse myself
really
from
bad
that.
idea.
You're very kind, but I didn't do it enough in the run-up to the referendum for a whole heap of reasons. But yeah, there were others.
I think the thing is that the people who were listening to these lies, the lies were feeding into their prejudices, which means it gave their prejudices a cause. And once that ball was rolling and all the emotive language that was being used to corral people into saying, yes, we can do this, it was almost unstoppable. And I think if there's one thing that positive could possibly come out of this is people to think, hang on, instead of me just listening to all these people bleating, let me look at the information myself. Let me analyze it and find the truth so I can make an informed decision for myself and not just follow people who are saying stuff which has no basis on the truth. That could be the only positive thing that comes out of this, that a more educated public may be one result.
You'll forgive me for not joining you just yet on the sunlit uplands of optimism that you so beautifully describe. I would like you to reserve me a spot, if you don't mind, on those sunlit uplands. But right now, as I glance at the front pages of the worst offenders from that catalogue of calumny that I continue to share with you today, they don't really seem to have learnt a single lesson. And of course, The Sun, which would be by far the worst offender, is now asking the DUP leader Arlene Foster to save the Brexit deal that, of course, the residents of Northern Ireland voted against. And they do so with a straight face and no sense of shame whatsoever.
Yeah, but it might be if we do this madness and crash out, and then the effects of this start to bite for real, then it may shock people into thinking, hang on, we've been sold a con here, and that may change things. I hope it doesn't come.
But I don't know. But I don't know. I mean, we've had an amazing week, and in some ways, an amazing couple of years listening to people describe what it feels like to have the scales fall from their eyes. And I do stress most sincerely that I do not blame people for having had those scales on their eyes, because as we've demonstrated today, the effort put into putting them there has been epic and immense. But I don't know how many would describe themselves like that. I find it very difficult to admit when I'm wrong. Nowhere near as difficult as I used to. I hope with maturity, so comes a certain openness, but most of us find it incredibly difficult to admit that we're wrong, especially when it is being portrayed as a con. No one wants to put their hand up and say, yes, I was conned. And maybe we need to rethink the language, Paul. I'm not sure. Tommy's in Dublin. I'll be with you first after the coming break. In the meantime, it's the end of Scooby-Doo, the Brexit episode. And people like me have been seeing monsters and terrible plans, and certainly, well, there is very, very compelling evidence that much of the money spent was from currently questionable sources. Electoral law was broken, Russian interference was present, Cambridge Analytica and Facebook algorithms, all of these things are real and present, but they are dangers that work only when viewed in the context 30 years of nonsense in our newspapers. That's all. Taken off the mask. A little bit late, of course, as we realise the villain was the British press all along. And instead of saying, and I would have got away with it too if it wasn't for your pesky kids, they're now desperately searching around for a self-exonerating excuse. And the best they've got is this. You know that vote 3 years ago that was built entirely upon lies that we'd been telling for 30 years? It's very important that we respect it. Theo Ashwood, LBC's political editor, will be popping in and out of the studio all day throughout all of our programmes as things change and develop. That key vote expected at 2:30. Slight change in the weather as a result of an amendment that's just been passed here.
What's happened, James, is that the government has come out and said that it would look at a proposal put forward by 6 Labour MPs, which would dictate that Parliament would set the next phase of the negotiations. This is what Geoffrey Cox, the Attorney General, has just told the House of Commons.
We've got to seem to have a little problem with the clip, such is the nature of the very live and fluid movement of news. Why don't you tell us in your own words, Theo?
So what's happened is that there was an amendment put down by Lisa Nandy, Gareth Snell, which would, in effect, bind the government to the next course of negotiations, because, of course, they're just dealing with the withdrawal agreement, which is the £39 billion divorce bill, Northern Ireland backstop and citizens' rights. And there's been a huge amount of fury about that. So what MPs have tried to do is to say, actually, we need to control where we end up in 2 years' time. Now, the Speaker didn't actually select amendments, but the government knowing that they have to get Labour MPs on side in order to offset the ERG, the European Research Group, and the DUP not supporting the bill, they've now said that they're going to look at that proposal.
It's more that, perhaps I've misunderstood, Geoffrey Cox is saying we would have considered that amendment
but
if
then
the Speaker
but then he's minded to. He's just said that he's minded to accept it, so that would then fall into the government's
And how many
motion.
numbers might that deliver? How many waivers?
They need it to deliver around 30 to 35, the government do, in order to offset what the ERG and the DUP not voting for it.
And these would be Labour MPs mostly from quite heavily Leave voting seats.
Absolutely, and we also
arguably doing the bidding of their constituents or covering their own backsides, depending on your perspective.
Exactly, and we're also talking about a lot of money being offered to each of those MPs for their constituencies, £100 million per constituent. That's what the talk is this morning, in order to get them on side, yeah.
Good grief.
So if you're from a Leave constituency, like, say, John Mann up in Bassetlaw, £100 million to spend in Bassetlaw on your, whether it's your local library, swimming pool, road infrastructure, whatever that might be.
So much control. Theo, I suspect we shall see you again before close of play today. Many thanks indeed. Tommy is in Dublin. We've taken off the mask, Tommy, and it was the British press all along. Interested in a perspective from the other side of the sea. What made you pick up the phone this morning?
Well, happy Brexit Day, first of all, James. The Hallmark cards haven't hit the shop, but I'm sure they will soon.
Thanks. Yeah.
But I think you're right. Look, the British media have subtly attacked the EU. But my
subtly?
point was that, well, yes, I grant you that.
Cumulatively, I suppose if it was one headline, as we said, in isolation, you could describe it as mischievous or subtle. But when we see them all listed together and going back over decades, disappearing over the retrospective horizon, there's nothing subtle about it at all. But I take your point, sorry.
Yeah, no, but my point was as well, like, I mean, you were dealing with a double-edged sword. Everything from... You've never seen the benefits of EU membership. No one ever sold them. Like, the Remain referendum was terrible. I was speaking to one of the guys there, and I was saying that about 10 years ago, I was working in Norway. There was no work in Dublin for me, so I went to Norway. And I was working with guys from Liverpool, Newcastle, Scotland, Belfast. I was working with all these British guys who were able to work in Norway because they were EU citizens.
Yes, of course.
They couldn't find jobs in their own place. They had specialist training, and it opened up a whole new industry for them, a whole new way of making money. It supplied money with to families and everything, and that never got talked about. It was all macro.
Well, I'm going to slightly challenge you on that, because obviously I give a lot of thought to this, and you're making a very valid point about the paucity of the Remain campaign, the weakness of the Remain campaign. But every single time they point it out, if memory serves, and I'm open to correction on this, every single time they pointed out things that we could currently do that we wouldn't be able to do after leaving the European Union, that would be their argument, somebody on the other side would simply turn around and say, yes, we will. Project Fear. And it's very hard to come back from that, because, of course, none of us know the future. You know, and I know, and some people took the time to establish what the treaties were, what the indivisibility of the four freedoms meant, what the Schengen Agreement as an evolution of freedom of movement had done to a country like Norway, and our freedom, your freedom to work there. But somebody on the other side, one of the liars, as opposed to one of the misled, would say that's not true, you know?
I take your point.
How do you come back from that? So you say, we've currently got this thing, it's great. I think in their minds, a lot of Brexiters thought we'd still be able to have freedom of movement because we're British. and it would just be all the foreigners that weren't allowed to come here anymore. I genuinely think that. I could be wrong, but I don't think I am.
But again, that comes back to the second point which I was going to make, which is the lack of understanding, say, within the British culture of what the EU does.
Yes.
I mean, over here in Ireland, every time a project is completed, like a motorway or railway network infrastructure or something, and it has received EU funding. Not complete, it hasn't been completely funded by the EU, but the sign goes up, a big sign with the EU flag on it that says partly funded by the EU.
Same in Greece, actually.
And it just means that every time you walk past something and you say, oh, that's really nice, that's a lovely building, that's a great road.
How often do you do that, Tom? How often do you walk past, there's a lovely building. I know what you mean, though. So you mean a brand new facility.
Yes, and you see that it has come from the EU. Money has benefited us from the EU, and even though, say, Britain, gives more into the EU than it takes back out in that particular funding, the access to these new markets that are there, it just seems to me that it was never fully explained exactly.
Well, the point you're making has just been beautifully highlighted by Theo Usherwood unintentionally, hasn't it? Because if these rumours and reports are true that Theresa May is tempting Labour rebels to support her deal by promising them money specifically for their constituencies, then you see that on one side, and on the other side you have the European Union allocating its development funds according to which areas most need it, as opposed to which areas are represented by MPs most susceptible to a bribe from Theresa May.
Exactly. And you can use it as cover then as well.
Yeah.
You can use that EU money to say, oh, well, this is what this Conservative government is going to build, or this is what this Labour government is going to build.
Well, that's part of the problem that you describe as well, in that the successive governments have tried to claim the credit for things that were partly down to them, but also partly, even perhaps largely, down to European Union investment, and not just investment, but also legislation. I think I realised that the madness was out of control when, after the Brexit vote had come in, people like Liam Fox and David Davis tried to pass off European Union legislation as having been enacted by the British government. Of course, both things are true, but the idea that, I'm thinking of roaming charges was the best example, wasn't it? When I think the Conservative Central Office tweeted some sort of sense of achievement about the abolition of roaming charges in Europe without mentioning that A, it was a European Union-led legislative programme, and B, it's one that we could quite easily fall out of if we ever actually get around to leaving. Oh, man alive. Thank you, Tommy. Here's the other thing that most of my callers today have brought into rather sharp relief, and this is where my new catchphrase, contempt for the con men, compassion for the conned, comes from. I worked this out yesterday. I think I've shared it with you as a sort of work in progress already. But here's the thing, all right? Here's the thing. Two people sitting at a table, right? Another person comes along and says, there's a fire in the next room. Or there's a pickpocket over there with his eye on your handbag. Or don't look now, but that bloke over there is about to punch you, right? There are two possible reactions to those reported threats, okay? Either you take evasive action immediately, you run for the hills, you flee, or fight. The alternative is simply to check whether it's true or not. So, someone tells you there is a massive threat, an enormous enemy, just out of sight. Do you look to be sure, or do you run? I think both responses are valid. EU ban on food waste means swans cannot be fed. Noise regulations to force football goers to wear earplugs. EU to ban high-heel shoes for hairdressers. So it goes on. And actually, I just fact-checked something that had been sent to me, because even though I'm incorrigible, is one of my most doughty and dedicated correspondents, and a profoundly knowledgeable individual at a time when knowledge is not desperately fashionable, I thought he might have misremembered this when he said that the Conservatives turned down EU funding when the food bank crisis first began to emerge, but he's dead right. This is from December of 2013. The government has been accused of putting anti-European ideology before the needs of the most deprived people in society after Britain rejected help from a European Union fund to help subsidise the costs of food banks. This was shortly after Michael Gove blamed the rise in food banks on financial mismanagement by families. David Cameron could have, if he wanted to, accessed up to £22 million worth of money from Brussels, reserved for those most in need across the whole of the European Union, but for fairly obvious or easy to understand political reasons, he elected not to. Would have been quite a hard sell, wouldn't it, while claiming that austerity was necessary and that we shouldn't bash the bankers. Obviously, a pay freeze for doctors, nurses, firefighters and police officers is the way to fill the gaps in the national budget caused by the bailout of the banks that caused the actual breakdown in the first place. No one had a problem with that, right? Everyone thinks the nurses should have paid for the financial crisis instead of the bankers that caused it. Yeah, okay, finally something we can all agree on. But of course, against that backdrop of universal agreement that nurses and firefighters should be paying for the cost of the financial crisis, not the bankers that caused it, it would have looked rather tricky for David Cameron then to accept money from those dreadful people in Brussels to feed starving Brits, or hungry Brits, desperate Brits. It's absolutely insane. 5 minutes after 11 is the time. That's that thought there. I really think that's important. That if there are two people sitting at a table and someone comes along and tells them that there's a really massive, dangerous threat just in the next room, 50% of us, or possibly 48% of us, will go and check. And 52% will run for the door on the other side of the room. And that's perfectly normal and natural. I think evolutionarily, we probably need both. There's probably a reason why both, because this is pure impulse and instinct, right? There's a threat over there. Run! There's a threat over there. Really? I'm a really person. You tell me there's a threat, I'm gonna go and have a look. Not in some circumstances, of course, if you have to take the analogy to a ludicrous extent, but generally speaking, two things occur to me. Do I trust this person telling me there's a threat? And that, of course, for many people will conjure up images of Farage standing in front of that despicable breaking point poster. Do I trust this person that's telling me a threat? That's my reaction. There's nothing wrong in reacting without asking, to shoot first, as they say, and ask questions later. And I think both are hardwired, perhaps, into our DNA. Might not have anything to do with nurture or education, and everything to do with nature and personality. I don't know. I just thought that was an interesting idea for us to nibble on at some point today. 7 minutes after 11 is the time. Is it too pat and lazy to blame it all on the media? You tell me. Paul's in Camden. Paul, what would you like to say?
The press are the villains of the piece. Yeah. And Nigel Farage is also a villain of the piece.
They kind of created him as well, actually, so I'm afraid that if you're going to cite him quite rightly as one of the worst offenders in this whole sorry saga, then the inflation and the promotion given to him by elements of the media has to be put on the record, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. Unfortunately, the so-called migrant crisis, which I call a refugee crisis, was fueled, and you mentioned massive, this sort of dangerous threat, the threat of the unknown. Yes. This was stirred up day after day, month after month, by all the media, not just the tabloids.
You're absolutely right.
About the migrant issue. And without that, I don't believe that we would be exiting the EU.
No, of course we wouldn't.
No. So this shows the power of the media. And what also shocked me, absolutely shocked me, was the advert that the Evening Standard allowed to be ran, at least I think it was once, by UKIP, which showed a queue of non-white males queuing to enter the country. I thought, how is it possible in this day and age?
Was that the breaking point?
Blatant racist advert could have been allowed to be printed in the Evening Standard.
Was that the breaking point poster?
I'm not sure what it was called.
I think it may have been. I don't. Were they queuing to enter this country, or were they queuing in some?
It was just a
long
queue.
line.
It
with
was
an echo of Nazi
non-white
propaganda. Yes, no,
males.
of course. I think that was the poster that I refer to occasionally. And of course, they weren't queuing to enter this country. The photograph was taken in somewhere like Hungary, but it didn't matter, did it? Because
no, it didn't matter. It was just the
propaganda through the ages,
preying on people's fears and xenophobia in this country.
I'm going to put xenophobia in brackets for once, Paul. Can I tell you why?
Yeah,
I'm going to put xenophobia in brackets because of what you just reminded us of. If the work has already been done in trying to portray all people fleeing Syria or the Middle East as rapists and sex offenders, if that work has already been done, then a photograph of loads of people of apparently Middle Eastern appearance, to react to that with fear is not actually xenophobic. It's something else. It's a prejudice, and it's an unpleasant impulse. But it's more forgivable than xenophobia because, as I said a moment ago, if someone whispered in your ear, "That man over there is a rapist," you would either check or you'd make sure that you kept as far away from him as possible. And the decision to keep as far away from him as possible, even when it emerges that he isn't what he's been described as, is not just forgivable, it's completely understandable. Isn't it?
It's preying on people's fears.
Yes, it is, but that's why I'm just putting xenophobia in brackets, because to have the fear,
but it's still racist. To me, they should have been taken to court, really, on that issue for stirring up racial hatred.
Yes, well,
that one image, I couldn't believe it, that in this day and age, such an advert could be printed.
And if it is the one I'm thinking of, I don't know whether it was done in the Evening Standard or whether it was confined to billboards, but the one I'm referring to, which sounds very similar to the one you're referring to, was, of course, unveiled just hours before Joe Cox was assassinated.
It was at the front of the Evening Standard.
I shall dig it out. Paul, I know that was your first ever call to a radio station. I hope you'd allow me to say that you acquitted yourself very, very well. 11 minutes after 11 is the time. Chris is in Uxbridge. Chris, what's going on?
Hi there.
Hello.
Well, I'm the person, I think, who may be the person to come and tell you two people at your table that there's a fire.
Go on.
And apparently, maybe even according to the last caller, under the piece, I wrote one of those articles when I was on a work experience at the Evening Standard, believe it or not, of all papers, when I was about 21.
Which one?
So my one was, and all of my own back, no one told me to write it, I investigated myself. My one was about fishing, but specifically about eels. So I went round to a few through the oldest pie and mash shops in London,
Manzies,
and asked them what they'd feel about not being able to serve up jellied eels anymore.
Where had you got the idea that European Union membership might prevent them from selling jellied eels?
I honestly can't really remember too much. I think
you're far too honest. I'm sure you haven't carved out a successful career in journalism, presumably, with this level of integrity and honesty.
No, I mean, it's the thing. I was desperate. I was doing an NCTJ journalism course at the time. I had to do work experience. I was, really keen to become a newspaper journalist, and I think it was off a report. I'd seen a report. Maybe some sort of report from an MEP, and
yes.
I saw that line and went for it, because ultimately I still kind of almost stand by that I thought that it was a good story.
I love you, Chris. I really do. I think your honesty is incredibly refreshing and actually necessary, because in the context of the kind of conversations that you and me understand in newspaper offices, but which perhaps some people outside of that world don't understand, that phrase there, good story, means a million different things. Really powerful impact. Researched up to a point. You don't need to triple check the accuracy of the thing that you're telling pie and mash or jellied eel salesmen that they need to be aware of. You're just asking them, how would you feel if this was true? So there is an ethical acrobatics to be undertaken, but at the end of it, you could still be standing upright.
And to one of your previous callers, you said, where were the stories about, me working in Norway? I think they were one of your previous callers. I mean, I'm also one of those people. I'm the son of an immigrant. I studied abroad in Spain. I worked abroad in Paris for a few years. I was working in Paris the day of the referendum. I'm as Remainer as they come, and I can see, seeing the benefits of the EU throughout my whole life.
But you were in a newsroom. You knew what would get you brownie points. You knew how to turn a sniff into a story, and lo and behold, that's exactly what you did. And you did indeed contribute to that overall sense of the EU being enemies of our... Here it is. It was about 2009, yeah?
No, this was in about... What, my story?
Yeah.
No, actually, it was about 2013, actually. Much closer.
Well, I hate to break it to you, Chris, mate.
Go on. Someone beat me to it.
Someone scooped you in 2009. Jellied eels, cooked and sold cold in their own stock, could soon join the ranks of Hazlitt, Stotty Cake and Barraberth as a dish that is only found in... Oh, no, hang on, you might be all right. Oh, no, it's from the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. And they take, I mean, you might have started with a different seed, but they fertilise that seed and grow it into something utterly bogus. But, of course, the seed arguably existed. Last time I checked, you could still buy jellied eels in London, Chris.
Yeah, I think so. I think you're right. I think the question is, and why is it a good story? And why are those arguments good arguments? Well, not necessarily good arguments, but why do
effective arguments.
And it's because, it's the whole tribal thing. It's the whole kind of thing that...
I've never touched a jellied eel in my life, but if those pesky Brussels bureaucrats are trying to take them away from us, then I will stand four square with the jellied eel salesmen and women of London, and I will not let them take our jellied eels. And that's not even funny anymore, is it? Because it could have been a Nigel Farage speech.
And I was tapping into the not only thinking about the pie and mash, but the oldest pie and mash shops. So going to the real core of,
No, I get it. To the core blimey love a duck Cockney heritage, and somehow trying to cast that as being in relief to European Union membership. I mean, to hear you describe it like that is absolutely fascinating, because I understand exactly what you were doing. And for the record, I'm sure you don't particularly care about this, but if my career had unfolded differently, I would have been doing what you were doing, I think. I was so desperate to be a journalist, and so... yeah, all right, enthralled to the grown-ups. If the grown-ups were doing that, then that was obviously the way that you do it. And my old dad might have given me the occasional clip around the ear and said, that's not proper journalism, son. And I'd have said, well, look at your old paper, The Telegraph, it's full of this crud. And he'd have said, yeah, doesn't mean it's right, boy. Where we're just sort of, I suppose you could say, it's a bit late, lads. But the role the media has played, I've spent 3 years unpicking this mess, wondering how people I like and respect, and in some cases love, could have done something that to me appeared to be so obviously silly. I no longer think that, actually. A lot of the stuff was actually plausible. I keep referring to the arguments about the German car industry, and a couple of you have pointed out the German car industry said at the time that the Brexiter portrayal of it as not being prepared to tolerate the notion of Britain leaving the single market was wrong. The German car industry did themselves say that's wrong. But, I can still see, especially as most of us aren't paying 100% attention 100% of the time, that would work. I don't know what the benefits were that you got as a result that made it worth taking that risk. But there's lots of stuff there. But in many ways, we've been looking at the tail instead of the dog, Because you look at that list of headlines, of stories, and then you ask, why on earth were people so easily persuaded that there was something bad on their doorstep rather than something, at best, ambivalent, but in reality, flawed but generally good? Certainly better than any other available arrangements, as the last 3 years have grindingly proved, although, of course, some people remain in denial. Nick's in St Albans. Nick, what would you like to say?
James, good to talk to you. I come from a different journalistic background to you. I've worked in TV news for many years, and I think that the TV news has let the country down. Really, I think that broadcast news has a different role than the newspapers in terms of the fact that there's an implied impartiality.
Yes,
and sometimes I think that in an effort to get a perception of balance, a lot of the difficult questions are not being asked, and a lot of the lies are not being exposed or challenged enough. So the idea of balance and impartiality and giving the same weight, it's kind of what you were saying earlier.
Because you'll have a panel, you'll have two people discussing something, they'll get equal weight and time, and regardless of what the subject matter is, at no point does the broadcaster referee that exchange, even in a percentage term, even by saying, well, 90% of the expert evidence is on your side of the argument and 10% is on yours. That will never influence how the debate is unfolded. So what I call on the other handism has kind of besieged not necessarily objective truth, but certainly the weight of evidence has been besieged by on the other handism.
I think that's absolutely right, and I don't wholly blame the broadcasters.
No, nor do I.
Because I can't remember a time when so many lies were told so blatantly. I mean, you go back to the referendum, and the stories about Turkey and European armies and all that sort of stuff. It just wasn't challenged because there was a perception that if you challenge it, you're taking sides. So I think that actually the broadcast media needs to look a little bit more at how they challenge perhaps some of these stories. I mean, there are some exceptions, but generally how they challenge these stories and slavishly following an agenda. I mean, I see Andrew Bridgen on television significantly more than Andrew Bridgen deserves to be on television, simply because he's prepared to talk and give a point of view, which may be completely invalid.
Like his entitlement to an Irish passport by dint of being born in England is something that no one brings up. Quite remarkable that these people are allowed to spout undiluted hogwash and then turn up the next day on the television as if it never happened.
Yeah, so I don't know what the answer is, but I think that
I do know what the answer is, but it's incredibly self-serving. Is we need more we need more shows that don't rely upon manufactured, confected confrontations between two people who are not equal partners, but who, by dint of what you describe as balance and impartiality, get treated as equal participants in a debate by all broadcast media. And now here's Ian Duncan Smith.
Yeah, but you will have had the same thing. I did a story about tunnels in Gaza once and got 2 very irate letters from the Palestinian support group accusing me of Israel bias, and from an Israeli support group accusing me of Palestinian bias.
Yes.
So hopefully what will come out of this is that somebody will take a step back, Ofcom, whoever it might be, and have a look at actually the way in which broadcasters are kind of, or feel like they're forced to report the news.
Partly the demands of the 24-hour market as well, I think. As younger men, we'd watch the news at 10 or the 9 o'clock news, the 6 o'clock news. We probably wouldn't see the lunchtime news because we'd be at work, or if we were journalists.
A great show.
No, well, I personally, I'd rather like the ITN lunchtime bulletins. I always have. But the point is that it's leached from the 24-hour news in that even the self-contained bulletins now feel the need to always have a debate and a discussion. And some things are not equal debates, are they? Most things actually are not equal debates.
Yeah, and I think that the media, particularly the broadcast media, which is perceived quite rightly as being impartial or more impartial than the print media, has a duty to actually be a little bit more robust, perhaps,
a little bit more clear-eyed, to have the courage of its convictions. I had this conversation with some TV news management actually not that long ago, and I just said, at some point you're going to have to turn around and just, however many complaints you get about X, Y or Z, you're going to have to turn around and say, no, sorry, these complaints are bogus. What you are alleging is not true. And that would involve being equally robust, in your case, with both the allegation of anti-Israeli sentiment in your report and the simultaneous allegation of anti-Palestinian sentiment. Nick, thank you so much. We won't talk about why you've never offered me a job on the telly. That would be too embarrassing, I think. 26 minutes after 11 is the time. Speaking of embarrassing, is he still the leader of UKIP, Mr. Batty? He is, isn't he? This week? I get so confused. They're all having picnics today, but some of them are having a march, and some of them are having a picnic, and some of them are having a protest, and now they're all arguing with each other. It's like the People's Front of Judea and the Judean People's Front, splitters. But Gerard Batty, who I think is still the leader of UKIP, tweeted earlier that there were reports that water cannon may be deployed in London today. He also wrote, some of the police may try to aggregate and provoke Brexiteers. I think we can all agree that we don't want to see the police aggregating anybody, do we, Mr. Batty? Of course, he's talking out of his hat. There are no water cannon in London. There are no reports that they may be deployed today. There are no water cannons that could be deployed by the Met Police because they don't own any. You may remember Boris Johnson, that magnificent paragon of virtue and anti-elite competence, spent £320,000 of our money on 2 water cannon. but then he was refused a licence to use them by the Home Secretary of his own party, Theresa May. I still have a little bit of me that thinks stuff like that should end careers, you know? But 320,000 is chicken feed compared to what he spaffed on that bridge, isn't it? But there we are. So the Met Police have now responded to Gerard Batty, saying those reports are indisputably false. No water cannons are owned or used by the Met Police. Any suggestion that we are intending to use water cannons or seeking to agitate any protesters is baseless and false. But, of course, if your whole shtick is selling a bogus narrative of victimhood, in the case of many members of the alt-right, that involves trying to persuade apparently heterosexual white males that they are somehow suffering from discrimination and worse, then you need to tell them, because there isn't any actual evidence of them being discriminated against or persecuted, so you need to tell them, for example, that they're going to shoot you with water cannons, lads. They're going to shoot you with water cannons. Somehow, that's probably all the fault of the Muslims as well, looking at recent developments in the so-called UK Independence Party. It's coming up to 11:29. Good God, is it really? Where's the day gone? Oh, yeah, you're right. I did inflict a 30-minute monologue on you at the top, which has possibly played havoc with your perceptions of the space-time continuum. Shall I do another one after the news? No? I've got quite a lot on my chest today. Look, the longer my monologue goes on, with me examining the current chaos, the less likely I am to spend 20 minutes patting myself on the back and saying, I told you so, about everything that's happened in the last 3 years. No? All right, we'll take more calls. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. If you, well, I'll tell you the number, and then when there is a phone line free, you hopefully will be able to grab it. But 0345 60 60 973. The question that underpins this morning's contemplations is actually quite a straightforward one. How dare they tell us that the vote needs to be respected when the vote was built upon lies that the same journalists and politicians telling us that the vote needs to be respected spent 3 decades perpetrating, disseminating and inventing? Quite incredible. We've got to respect the vote. Why? Because people voted. Yes, but why did they vote? Well, because they thought the EU was going to nick their rocking horses, or they thought the EU was going to make them hand in their used sex toys, or they thought the EU was making cows wear nappies, or they thought the EU was about to do this, or they thought the EU was about to do that. All those things have turned out to be untrue. But we still have to respect the vote. Hey? Where a few things have come into focus today. Obviously, it's not the first time that we have listed the calumnies inflicted upon an utterly undeserving population by members of my profession for, sadly, I have to say, best part of 30 years. But I do think that thing about the visceral, almost instinctive response to a reported threat is really interesting. I don't know how it's going to lend itself to you calling me, to be honest. But often you surprise me with ways into subjects once I've sort of just put up the framework of the conversation. 2 people told that there's a massive threat, a danger, just in the next room. Half of us go and check, half of us leg it. How many times would you leg it before you started going to check? I don't know the answer to that question. Is that the basis of The Boy Who Cried Wolf? I think it is. Before I became a best-selling author, I wrote a little book for LBC called Loathe Thy Neighbour, which oddly has clearly done a little bit of business off the back of my my Penguin book, because I got a royalty statement through the other day from the publishers of Loathe Thy Neighbour, and it's not terribly good, I don't think. In all honesty, it's not bad. I mean, but I tried to explain why I never bought into The Boy Who Cried Wolf story, because if he was looking after my sheep and my sheep were my livelihood, then even if he'd lied 10 times, I couldn't take the risk that he might be lying the 11th time. Do you see what I mean? So you're familiar with the story of the boy. I have to occasionally double check because I work with unconscionably young colleagues these days. You're familiar with the tale of the boy who cried wolf? This isn't something that's generationally linked. So the lad cries wolf when there isn't one because he derives immense amusement from seeing all the panic. Oh my God, he's Boris Johnson. Isn't he? Oh, so funny when I heard the sound of the greenhouses smashing under the weight of the rocks I was lobbing from Brussels. Rocks in this context being a synonym for lies. And they never stopped believing him, did they? So Boris Johnson has been crying wolf for 30 years, since he arrived in Brussels after being fired from the Times for making up a quote from his own godfather. All he's done for his entire life is just shout wolf and then laugh as the peasants panicked. Oh my goodness me. I'm really sorry for not having spotted that sooner. So the Boris who cried wolf is still going to be believed even after 10, 11. I mean, look, what did we just do? What did we just do then? 320 grand on water cannon that he wasn't allowed to use because he's an imbecile. Does he get away with it? Wolf! Of course he does. Millions and millions and millions of pounds on a bridge that has never and will never exist. Does he get away with it? Of course he does. Next time he comes along and says something, yeah, let's all panic. Here's Boris with his big warnings, still in the running to be the next Prime Minister, still in the running to be the next leader of the Conservative Party. The only Foreign Secretary one can remember whose entire contribution to public life was to further endanger an already imprisoned British citizen. That's it. What did you achieve as Foreign Secretary? Well, made Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe's life even worse than it was already. So she was in solitary confinement in an Iranian jail. How could you have made it even worse than it was already? Oh, trust me, I'm Boris. Wolf! And that, I think, is the disconnect between me and the people who I don't think we're ever going to be able to reconcile with. Because, and that's what I mean by the forelock tugging and the cap doffing. Because what more evidence do you need that you put your faith in people who didn't deserve it than Jacob Rees-Mogg sitting on Newsnight saying, I will be voting for slavery. I will be doing the thing I described. That's the worst available option. You're not going to see through him now. You never are you? If you haven't seen through Boris Johnson already, you never will. I'm a Christian, so I will always love you. But I don't think I will ever be reconciled with you, because you could literally be presented with a piece of moon rock and you could lick it and still pronounce that it was cheese. And there's nothing I can do then. And why do you think it's cheese? Well, because Boris said so. Jacob said so. The utter demonstration of how unworthy they are of your trust is complete. It cannot be any clearer. These people who have seen you fall out with friends and family because they somehow managed to perpetrate the myth that the Irish border, the British border in Ireland, wasn't going to bring it all crashing down around their ears. You've seen it happen now. It's happened. The things they said wouldn't happen have happened, and the thing they said they would never do, they are doing. But if they shouted wolf tomorrow, then a proportion of the villagers would still run to the fields, wouldn't they? And that's what I don't get, and I don't think I ever will. It's not just a question of not being able to reconcile with you, but I don't think you're ever going to recognise what I've just described. You're never going to see yourself. I'm not one of those people. Do you trust Jacob Rees-Mogg still? Yes. Well, then you are one of those people. How can you trust someone who has betrayed you so completely? Well, you're just jealous. Yeah, okay, mate, fill your boots, but how can you trust someone who has betrayed you so completely? And that's what I'm here for, just holding up that mirror. And you hate what you see. And you move very quickly from hating what you see to denying that it's you. Jacob Rees-Mogg and Boris Johnson have displayed utter contempt for the people who have expressed the most support for them over the last 2 or 3 years. Utter and complete contempt. Jacob Rees-Mogg's mask slipped even further 2 days ago in the House of Commons when he essentially sought to describe anybody who hadn't been to Eton as unworthy of consideration. So I hold up this mirror now. Look, this is you. You're the people who've been utterly mugged and conned by Jacob Rees-Mogg and Boris Johnson, and I'm going to cautiously suggest that you still support them. You still think they're sound. And there's you, still supporting them, still thinking they're sound, denying that that's your reflection in the mirror I'm holding up. And I don't know that I can build a bridge between those two communities, actually, for all my efforts and compassion. I just don't, because they have shouted wolf 30 times. We have run to the field 30 times. There has never been a wolf. But the 31st time they shout wolf, you're going to run there. And I don't really know why, because they're not actually protecting you from anything except a mythical... Actually, dragon would be better, wouldn't it, than wolf? The boy who cried dragon. Because dragons don't even exist. At least there's a plausible possibility that a wolf might have wandered into our meadows. But there are no dragons. Jacob shouts dragon, and you run. I don't get that. I really don't. I suspect I never will. Anna is in Edinburgh. Anna, what would you like to say? If you're still awake, I do apologise. You weren't expecting that, and nor was I, but hey, we are where we are.
No, don't worry. Hello, James.
Hello,
it's
Anna.
such a pleasure
Likewise.
to be part of it. Well, where do I start, to be honest? Where do I start? Well, I hate this mess.
Yes.
I feel very deceived, totally and utterly deceived by the fact that I was treated as some kind of a second-class non-citizen existing here and preaching on the goodness of British soil and citizens.
Yes.
What I mean is, well, two things. Scottish independence referendum.
Yes.
I had the right to vote. I'm Polish. Been living here 15 years. Never took a penny from Social Security.
I don't want people to say that on my programme, because what if you'd been poorly? I don't want taking money from the welfare state to become something that people feel the need to distance themselves from. The welfare state is the proudest achievement of this country ever, with the possible exception of the NHS. And if you were sick and you needed support, or if you lost your job and you needed support, you would be entitled to it. Don't let that narrative of scrounging be the beginning of your contribution.
You see, that's the contamination of the whole thing.
I know. It's a perfect illustration, isn't it?
As if I need to justify myself.
Yes. Not here.
Which is itself.
Not here.
Exactly. Well, thanks. So in Scottish referendum, I had the right to vote. Thank you, Nicola Sturgeon. I feel very patriotic towards Scotland because of that. But I was totally disregarded if it comes to UK. Let's pack our bags and go. Leave something that we can only benefit from. Referendum, which I can't get over it.
What were the criteria? I mean, I've already whipped myself and donned my hair shirt several times for not knowing as much about Scottish politics as I should. But what were the criteria for voting in the ref? How long did you have to have been there for? Are you registered in some way, or are you...
No, there was no such thing as being registered. You would need to be here for 5 years.
So and on the electoral register, presumably.
Yeah. Being enrolled, which is like a standard thing, you're moving flat, you receive a little note, and then you get to vote. And I totally appreciate this point of view. Well, I'm here, I contribute, I'm part of the society.
Yes, well, some people, of course, would say that because you weren't born here, you shouldn't have been entitled to that vote. But, of course, they would struggle to explain why Daniel Hannan, Douglas Carswell and Boris Johnson, who weren't born here either, should have been entitled to manipulate the vote in such a spectacular fashion.
Precisely, and that's my point. I got so... scared simply of all this mess that's been happening, that being a single mom, which is obviously a mom of a teenage daughter, which is quite important because they, money-sucking machines, I had to have my family to contribute so that we can both apply for a British passport.
Yes.
And do I want a red British passport? Well, I'm not proud of it.
Well, and if you had to explain to your teenage daughter how this had happened, what would you say?
Well, I'm lacking any kind of explanation.
Yeah.
I'm trying to tell her that, well, if simple people are being fed lies for long enough, they start believing it. It's like Middle Ages.
Yes, it is like the Middle Ages, actually. I mean, ducking witches and burning heretics is the metaphorical environment in which we find ourselves. Anna, I mean it. Never, ever, ever, ever feel you have to justify yourself as not having taken advantage of one of the finest institutions, because I tell you, you can judge the value of the welfare state by the identity of the people who hate it.
Thank you, James. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Anna. I think we're going to talk about something else after 12 o'clock. I'm quite tempted to talk about... if you get nostalgic for the days before Brexiters inflicted such untold and unnecessary damage upon our country, I can't even remember what my favourite subjects were before that, but I used to enjoy talking about foie gras because I like being wrong, if you see what I mean, or I like examining how I can still cling to a position that I know is unjustified. It gives me an insight into what it must be like to be a Brexiter or a Jacob Rees-Mogg fan. Somewhere inside, you know that you're wrong. Somewhere inside. And then, luckily, I don't lash out at the people telling me I'm wrong anymore, but I used to. I get very, very rude and nasty about vegetarians and vegans attacking my enthusiasm for that delicacy, and indeed my enthusiasm for meat in general. It's to really bridle against it, but then you get a glimpse of what you're turning into and you realise that there's no point having a mind if you never change it, or at least if it's never ever open. So I know that foie gras is a fairly grim thing, and I'm not cultivating mischief or deliberately trying to provoke you when I say it's also delicious. And with your help, we can have a look at that psychological contradiction after 12, unless you feel the need to continue discussing Brexit ad infinitum. I'd probably be happy to. Adam is in Hatfield. Adam, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Great show.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to... I agree everything you've said about the effect of the media over the last 30 years slowly poisoning attitudes towards Europe. The thing I wanted to point out, though, really, is that when you look at the surveys, and obviously we know about the reliability of them, but generally the surveys showed support for the European Union in excess of 60% right the way up into the 2000s.
Yes.
And it's only really 2010 when austerity came in that things started to change. And I guess, I mean, when you look at as well, the University of Warwick did a report looking into austerity and the effect it had on the Brexit vote, and they came to the conclusion that austerity was a huge driver in the areas that did vote leave. And I think the thing that we forget is that, you know, we're quite fortunate. We live in nice middle-class areas, have nice middle-class lives, and we can take opinions on Brexit and all those other things from a position of comfort. Whereas to people who lived in, you know, parts of the country that have been abandoned and forgotten for many years by successive governments, you know, austerity was just the final kick in the crotch. That was the point at which you're like, I've had enough of what you're doing to me.
I don't dispute any of your analysis, except the bit where you say we weren't aware of it. I mean, the point was, we're back to Boris Johnson crying wolf. I don't think that we paid enough attention to the notion that people would be susceptible to the lie that their plight, their situation was a result of European Union membership. I mean, did you hear the story earlier, Adam, from 2013, when David Cameron turned down money from the European Union?
I remember that when it happened as well.
I didn't remember that when it happened, and I do this for a living. So think about how that plays out. So you are going to a food bank. You can't believe the circumstances in which you found yourself. Someone is whispering in your ear that it's all the fault of European Union membership, and if we leave... I got one yesterday. I don't get many now, but I got one yesterday saying, you've got no idea what it's like not to have enough money. As soon as we're out of the European Union, the better. These people are going to be poorer, but the worse you're present, the more perhaps seductive a fantasy future becomes.
I agree. I think if you know, there is nobody more dangerous than somebody that has lost hope.
Yeah.
Those are the people that are most vulnerable and most susceptible. And we see this, you know, throughout history. The way that the far right seduces people is by coming to them as their friend first, telling them they understand their problems, they care about them, and they know why they're suffering. And eventually they come to you, here's the answer.
I mean, anyone wondering where the anti-elite nonsense comes from, bankrolled and promoted by the owners of the Ritz Hotel and perpetrated by people like Jacob Rees-Mogg, who owns an actual monocle, talking about him being an enemy of the elites. That's precisely what they're doing.
Yeah, and I agree, and it's an oxymoron. It doesn't make any sense.
Doesn't matter.
It's that thing of, if somebody is standing by your side and telling you that they're fighting for you, you'll overlook stuff like that, because the feeling is that everybody else is against you. I mean,
look at
these
Trump.
poor people who live in these places. I mean, I studied in Manchester and I lived in Moss Side, and I saw what life was like. You know, when I was there, unemployment rate for black males between the ages of 16 to 24 was 85%.
Correct.
You know, if you live in those kinds of areas, nobody cares about you. And so if somebody, however fake and duplicitous it may seem to us, if they come to you and say that they genuinely want to help you, at some point you're just going to be grateful that somebody actually took an interest in you.
And if the scapegoat that they're using is one that has been drip-fed as a pantomime villain for 30 years, with everything from tea bags banned from being recycled on the BBC, British Lav to be replaced with Euroloo, in the Sun, bosses to be told what colour carpets to buy by EU, it's just done it. It's done its job without you noticing. That is
when
what...
it bites. That's when it bites. The rest of the time while you're doing well, you ignore it because you don't care about it because you're doing all right. But when you've been abandoned, you want somebody to blame eventually because, you know, and especially we've got to understand what austerity did. Austerity told people who were poor and struggling that it was their fault.
Of course it did.
That they were to blame. That the banks that had brought us to our knees were no longer the person who needed to repay their debt to society, but it was you, the unemployed, you, the single mum, claiming tax credits. It's your fault. The disabled. And we've allowed that narrative to take hold, and it's pretty disgusting when you actually look at it, that we bailed out the banks so that they could pay themselves huge bonuses, which they did.
Yeah.
And at the same time, we turned to the weakest and most vulnerable members of society and absolutely hammered them without any second thought. And the worst part is, again, the media carried on that narrative, blaming them, knowing full well that they weren't to blame.
Yeah.
I mean, what other place do you go to where your rich uncle runs off with the family silver, and instead of chasing him down or going to another rich uncle to help lend you money to get you out of it, you go to the poorest members of society and take everything that they have? That's what we've done, and I don't think people pay enough attention to that. I mean, I'm thankfully unaffected by austerity, but just talking about it makes me so angry because it's just so unjust. And yet we've moved on from that discussion. And Brexit has become this all-encompassing thing. And, you know, I went on both marches and I talked to a lot of people when I was there. And the thing that I kept trying to reiterate to people is, if Brexit is cancelled, that's not the end. We have to repair society. We have to help the people that we have ignored and, to some extent, pushed to the very margins. And we're all complicit in this because we allow it to happen, and it's a democracy.
Yeah.
And we go out and campaign for Europe, that's great. But please go out and campaign for the disabled, go out and campaign for the unemployed, for the forgotten who have no voice. That's our responsibility, I feel, as citizens of the country. You know, be the change you want to see.
Do you want to do my holiday cover? I love you,
I do
mate.
apologise, I've gone on a bit of a rant.
Well, yeah, pot kettle, Adam. You're coming on my show to apologise for going on a bit of a rant. I've broken all records today. But my goodness me, you brought a swell to my heart, Adam. You really did.
Well, thank you. It's been for many a years, but nobody seems to want to listen to me.
Well, I do, and I always will. And if the seal is broken, long may the flood continue. You can't find fault with a single thing he said, unless you're in the business of smashing mirrors because you hate what they've turned you into. Last word to Neil, who's in Doncaster. Neil, what's it going to be?
Hey, James.
Hello, Neil.
I liked your metaphor about the fire in the other room. Do you go and check?
Yes.
Or
half of us run, half of us check.
I just wanted to add a bit of context to it. I think if you've got two people in a white room sat at a table, more than 48% of them, if someone ran in and said fire, they'd go and have a look. Imagine instead these two people are sat in a Wetherspoons pub. There's beer mats on every table saying vote leave.
Oh, God.
The staff are walking around reading Tim Martin's ridiculous propaganda from his magazine because they've been threatened that they won't get any hours on their 0 hours contract if they don't.
Oh, hang on, he's over there on the telly as well. Actually, they don't have tellies in Wetherspoons.
Now, on the telly, there's tellies all the way around that's showing a perpetual loop of Nigel Farage's greatest lies. On the other side of the door, Boris Johnson has a big cigar and he's blowing smoke through the keyhole every now and then. Tim Martin's famous unique carpets that he's so proud of are actually all made up of front covers of the Daily Express and the Daily Mail. And you've been in this pub for 30 years. If someone then runs in, for example, Jacob Rees-Mogg comes in and says, there's a fire, you must believe me because I went to Eton, you're going to find any excuse to run.
Two things, right? Do you know what you are?
Yeah. What?
You're a typical Wickhamist.
Oh, thank you very much.
The second thing, this only ever happens on Thursdays, but for you and for Adam, I'm going to make an exception. Thank you, Neil. Mind how you go. Have a great weekend.